The dusty road stretched out like a scarred vein across the scorched skin of the Texas landscape, a ribbon of caliche and gravel that seemed to lead nowhere and everywhere all at once. Heat waves shimmered off the horizon, turning the distant mesquite trees into dancing ghosts, while the relentless sun beat down with the weight of a heavy iron hammer. It was the kind of heat that settled deep in your bones, the kind that made the air thick enough to chew, smelling of dry sagebrush and baking earth. A lone hawk circled high above, a silent sentinel in the cloudless blue expanse, watching a white Chevrolet Silverado kick up a trail of fine, powdery dust as it rumbled toward the city limits of Dallas. Inside the truck, the air conditioning was fighting a losing battle, but the man behind the wheel didn't seem to mind. George Strait hummed along to a Merle Haggard tune fading in and out of the static on the AM radio, his fingers tapping a rhythmic beat on the steering wheel. At 71, the lines on his face were like the topographical maps of the hill country he loved so dearly, deep, weathered, and telling stories of a life lived fully. He wasn't wearing the sequins or the starched shirts of the stadium lights today. He was just George. He wore a faded blue work shirt with a fraying collar, a pair of Wrangler jeans that had seen more saddle leather than laundry detergent, and a Resistol hat that was stained with the honest sweat of a working rancher. He was heading into the heart of Dallas, a place of glass towers and concrete canyons that felt a world away from the quiet solitude of his porch. Today was special. Tomorrow was Norma's birthday. 50 years, half a century of waking up next to the same woman, of weathering the storms of fame, the loss of a child, the quiet moments of joy, and the thunderous applause of millions. She was his anchor, his North Star. The only reason the king of country hadn't lost his crown or his mind in the chaotic whirlwind of the music industry. He wanted to get her something that wasn't just expensive, but meaningful. He was heading to the Gilded Spur, a boutique that had recently opened in the high-end district, rumored to carry vintage silk scarves from Italy, Norma'S weakness. George pulled the truck into the parking lot of the exclusive shopping plaza. His vehicle, coated in a layer of ranch dust, looked like a rough intruder amidst the gleaming rows of Mercedes, Bentleys, and pristine Range Rovers that had never seen a speck of mud. As he stepped out, the oppressive heat of the parking lot hit him, contrasting sharply with the automatic sliding glass doors of the Gilded Spur that whooshed open to release a blast of frigid, perfumed air. The interior of the store was a temple to excess. It was designed to look rustic, but it was the kind of rustic that cost millions to manufacture. The floorboards were reclaimed barnwood, polished to a mirror shine that would be ruined by a single scuff of a boot. The chandeliers were made of antlers, but they were dipped in 24-karat gold. The scent in the air was a curated mix of cedar and expensive leather, devoid of the actual smell of horses or livestock. It was a costume shop for the wealthy, a place where oil tycoons and tech billionaires came to buy the aesthetic of the cowboy without ever having to shovel a stall. George adjusted his hat and walked in, his boots clicking softly on the wood. He felt the immediate weight of eyes on him, not the adoring eyes of fans, but the judgmental, scanning eyes of the staff. To them, he wasn't George Strait, the living legend. He was just an old man in dirty clothes. Standing behind the counter, looking bored and scrolling through a tablet, was Julian. Julian was a man who had curated his appearance with the precision of a surgeon. His suit was Italian, cut so slim it looked painted on. His shoes were patent leather, ending in a point sharp enough to puncture a tire. His hair was gelled into an immovable helmet of dark brown. Julian didn't sell clothes. He sold exclusion. He looked up as George entered, his lip curling slightly at the sight of the dust on George's jeans. He didn't move to greet him. He simply watched, like a predator deciding if the prey was worth the energy of the chase. A young girl, no older than 20, was folding shirts on a display table nearby. Her name tag read Sarah. She looked up and offered a tentative, warm smile, her eyes kind. She started to move toward George, but Julian cleared his throat loudly, a sharp, cutting sound that stopped her in her tracks. He shot her a look that said, "Don't waste your time on the riffraff." Sarah lowered her eyes and went back to folding, though she cast a sympathetic glance at the old cowboy. George ignored the tension. He was used to being underestimated when he wasn't holding a guitar. He wandered over to a glass display case where the silk scarves were laid out like jewels. They were beautiful, deep crimsons, vibrant teals, patterns of wildflowers that reminded him of the spring bloom in San Antonio. He saw one in particular, a soft lavender with silver threading. It was perfect. It matched the dress Norma had worn on their 25th anniversary. He smiled, the memory warming him more than the Texas sun ever could. He reached out, his hand hovering over the glass, imagining the look on Norma's face. He could see her laughing, that soft, melodic sound that was better than any song he had ever written. He was about to signal Sarah to ask for the price when he felt the vibration against his thigh. It wasn't a ring. It was a long, sustained buzz. A notification. George pulled his smartphone from his pocket. It was a modern device, a necessity of the business, though he often longed for the days of landlines and letters. The screen was bright in the dim, ambient lighting of the store. A banner notification from the bank sat at the top. Sender. Norma subject, transaction alert, urgent. George frowned. Norma never handled the heavy banking. She preferred the checkbook. He unlocked the phone, his thumb swiping across the glass. The banking app opened automatically, facial recognition logging him in. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The background music of the store, some generic soulless jazz, faded into a high-pitched whine in his ears. Checking 0.00, savings 0.0. Investment liquid assets 0.0. He blinked. He rubbed his eyes with his free hand, thinking perhaps the glare or his age was playing tricks on him. He looked again. The zeros stared back, cold and absolute. Millions of dollars. Decades of touring, of record sales, of investments. Gone. Then, a text message popped up, sliding over the banking app. It was from Norma. Norma. Transfer complete. Balance remaining 0.0. Goodbye. The phone slipped from his fingers, clattering loudly onto the glass display case before sliding off and hitting the floor with a dull thud. George didn't reach for it. He couldn't feel his hands. A cold numbness started in his chest and radiated outward, freezing his blood. Goodbye. The word echoed in his mind, bouncing around the hollow chamber that had been his heart just seconds ago. Goodbye. Not, I love you. Not, see you at dinner. Just goodbye. 50 years. He thought of the morning coffee, the way she brushed her hair, the way she held his hand when the road got too long and the nights got too lonely. Had it all been a lie? Had she been planning this? The mind, in moments of trauma, is a cruel storyteller. It began to stitch together a narrative of betrayal. The times she stayed up late on her laptop, the hushed phone calls he had ignored, thinking she was planning a party. The way she had hugged him extra tight this morning. Was that a goodbye hug? A Judas kiss? George Strait, the man who stood tall before roaring crowds of 80,000 people, grabbed the edge of the glass counter to keep from collapsing. His knees buckled. His breath came in short, ragged gasps. He felt a physical pain in the center of his chest, a tearing sensation, as if his soul was being ripped away from his body. He wasn't the king of country anymore. He was a broken old man, standing in a store he didn't belong in, realizing that the love of his life had apparently taken everything and left him with nothing but the dust on his boots. The sound of the phone hitting the floor had shattered the quiet atmosphere of the Gilded Spur. Julian looked up from his tablet, his eyes narrowing. He didn't see a man in agony. He saw a disruption. He saw a dirty, possibly drunk old man making a scene in his pristine showroom. Julian stepped out from behind the counter, smoothing his suit jacket. He walked with a clipped, aggressive stride, the heels of his shoes striking the wood like gunshots. He approached George, who was now leaning heavily on the display case, his head bowed, his shoulders shaking with silent, dry sobs that he couldn't suppress. "Excuse me." Julian's voice was like ice, sharp and cutting. "Sir, you are disturbing the other clientele." There were no other customers in the store, only George, Julian, and a terrified Sarah who was watching from the shirt display, her hands covering her mouth. George didn't answer. He couldn't. His brain was trying to process the concept of zero. $0, zero wife, zero future. He was trapped in the notification, the glowing letters burned into his retinas. Julian stepped closer, invading George's personal space. He smelled of expensive cologne and arrogance. He looked down at the phone on the floor, then at the scarf George had been admiring. In his shock, George had knocked a mannequin slightly, and the lavender scarf had fluttered to the ground, landing near his dusty boots. "Look at this," Julian hissed, his voice dripping with disdain. "You've dropped your phone, you're leaning on the glass, which I will have to have cleaned, and now you've thrown merchandise on the floor. Is this some kind of sick joke, or are you just intoxicated?" George slowly lifted his head. His eyes, usually a piercing, lively blue, were dull and watery. He looked at Julian, but he didn't really see him. He saw a blur of a person. George's voice was a rasp, a broken whisper. "My wife, Norma..." Julian rolled his eyes. "I don't care about your wife, and I certainly don't care about your domestic squabbles. This is a high-end establishment, not a dive bar for washed-up cowboys to cry in their beer. You need to leave now." George tried to straighten up. The cowboy code ingrained in him since birth demanded dignity. "Stand up, George," he told himself. "Don't let them see you bleed." He took a shaky breath. He needed to call her. He needed to hear her voice. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe she was kidnapped. The desperation clawed at his throat. He bent down, his joints popping audibly in the silence, and retrieved his phone. The screen was cracked, a spiderweb of fractures across the image of his grandchildren he used as a wallpaper. He pressed the side button. The notification was still there. Goodbye. He dialed her number. His fingers trembled so badly he hit the wrong digit twice before connecting. He held the phone to his ear, his eyes closed, praying, pleading with a God he suddenly felt had abandoned him. "The number you have reached is no longer in service. Please check the number and try again." Disconnected. The finality of the automated voice was a physical blow. George swayed. He dropped the phone into his pocket, missing the fabric and letting it fall deep into the lining of his coat. "She's gone," George whispered. The reality settled on him like a shroud. "She took it all." Julian laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound. "Ah, the classic story. The old wife finally got tired of the smell of manure and took the retirement fund? Tragic, truly, but not my problem." Julian snapped his fingers. "Sarah, get the security guard from the mall entrance, now." Sarah hesitated. "Mr. Julian, he looks sick. Maybe we should call a doctor, or offer him water." "I said call security," Julian barked, his face twisting into a sneer. "He's not sick, Sarah. He's a vagrant. Look at him. Look at those boots. He's probably been wandering the highway and decided to come in here to beg or steal. I want him out before a real customer walks in." George felt a surge of something hot amidst the cold grief. Indignation. He was George Strait. He had shaken hands with presidents. He had built hospitals. He wasn't a vagrant. He reached for his wallet. He still had his cards. The bank account said 0, but surely the credit lines. He had the black card. The Centurion. Unlimited. "I am not a vagrant," George said, his voice gaining a fraction of its famous timbre, though it still wavered. "I was going to buy the scarf." He pointed a shaking finger at the lavender silk on the floor. Julian raised an eyebrow. "You? Buy that? That scarf costs more than your truck, old man. It's $600. Imported. Hand-dyed." "I'll take it," George said, pulling out the heavy black titanium card. "Ring it up and I'll leave." He just wanted to get out. He wanted to buy the gift, a talisman of the hope that maybe, just maybe, if he bought it, she would come back. It was irrational, but grief is never rational. He wanted to hold the scarf she would have worn. Julian looked at the card. He recognized the weight of it, the color. For a second, doubt flickered in his eyes. But then he looked back at George's face, the devastation, the dust, the tears. Stolen, Julian thought, or cancelled. "Fine," Julian said, snatching the card from George's hand with unnecessary force. "Let's entertain this fantasy. But if this declines, which it will, I'm pressing charges for attempted fraud." Julian walked to the counter. He picked up the scarf from the floor with 2 fingers, as if it were contaminated waste, and tossed it onto the scanner. Beep. He inserted the card. He stared at George with a smug grin, tapping his fingers on the marble countertop. "Processing," Julian drawled. waiting for the inevitable. The machine beeped loudly. A red light flashed. The notification from the bank had been literal. Accounts closed meant everything. The credit lines were tied to the assets. Norma, or whoever had done this, had been thorough. The financial identity of George Strait had been erased. Julian let out a triumphant huff. Just as I thought. He pulled the card out and tossed it. He didn't hand it back. He threw it like a frisbee. It skittered across the polished floor and landed near the door. "Declined," Julian announced, his voice booming in the empty store. "You are broke, you are a fraud, and you are trespassing." George stared at the card on the floor. It was the ultimate humiliation. In the span of 10 minutes he had lost his wife, his fortune, and now his dignity was being shredded by a man who measured worth by the shine of a shoe. George stammered. "There must be a mistake. The bank—" "The only mistake," Julian interrupted, walking around the counter to tower over George, "was you thinking you could walk into the Gilded Spur and pretend to be one of us. We serve the elite, sir, the movers and shakers, not senile cowboys who get dumped by their wives and forget they're destitute." Sarah, the young intern, couldn't take it anymore. She rushed to the water cooler in the back and filled a paper cup. She hurried over to George, ignoring Julian's glare. "Here, sir," she said softly, offering the water. Her hands were shaking too. "Please, drink this. You look pale." George looked at her. In her eyes, he saw the same kindness he had seen in his fans for decades. The humanity. It was a lifeline. He took the cup with trembling hands. "Thank you, darling," he whispered. Julian snatched the cup from George's hand before he could take a sip, splashing the water onto George's shirt and the floor. "No handouts," Julian screamed. "Sarah, you are fired. Get your things and get out. I will not have my staff coddling criminals." Sarah gasped, tears springing to her eyes. "But Mr. Julian, he's a human being." "He is a nuisance." Julian turned back to George. "And you. I'm giving you 10 seconds to walk out that door before I physically remove you myself. I don't care how old you are. I will drag you by that cheap hat and throw you into the street where you belong." George stood there, water dripping from his frayed shirt. His heart shattered, his legacy seemingly dissolved. The silence in the room was heavy, suffocating. He looked at the door. He looked at the card on the floor. He looked at Julian, whose face was twisted in a mask of ugly superiority. This was the bottom, the absolute bottom. He was George Strait, the king. But in this moment, in this air-conditioned nightmare, he was just a confused, heartbroken old man being bullied by a tyrant in a suit. But deep down, beneath the layers of shock and grief, a tiny spark remained, an ember of the Texas spirit that had survived droughts, floods, and heartbreak before. It was faint, but it was there. Suddenly, the silence was broken again, not by a text, but by a video call ringtone. It was the classic jarring ringtone of a default phone setting. It was coming from George's pocket. George froze. He reached into his pocket, his hand brushing against the wet fabric of his shirt. He pulled out the phone. The screen was lit up. A face was on the caller ID. Incoming video call. Norma. George stared at it. His breath caught in his throat. Was she calling to gloat? To say goodbye face to face? Or was it a mistake? Julian scoffed. "Oh, look. The runaway wife calls. Probably to tell you where she hid the money. Answer it outside." George ignored him. His thumb hovered over the green button. He was terrified. He was terrified that answering this call would confirm the nightmare. But he was George Strait. He didn't run from the truth. He pressed accept. The screen flickered, the connection stabilizing. And there was Norma. But she wasn't on a beach in the Cayman Islands. She wasn't sitting in a lawyer's office. She was sitting in a dusty, sun-drenched room with wood-paneled walls. Behind her, through a window, George could see a familiar oak tree, a tree he hadn't seen in 20 years. She was crying. Tears were streaming down her face, but she was smiling, a terrified, exhausted, exhilarated smile. "George?" Her voice came through the tiny speaker, tinny but unmistakable. "George, honey, can you hear me?" George held the phone with both hands, bringing it closer to his face, ignoring Julian, who was tapping his foot impatiently. "Norma?" George choked out. "Norma, the bank? The message?" It said goodbye. It said 0. Norma let out a sob that sounded like a laugh. Oh God, George, I know. I've been trying to call you for 10 minutes. The bank's automated system, it sent the wrong notification code. It wasn't supposed to say goodbye. It was supposed to say transfer complete, Project Legacy. Project Legacy, George whispered, confusion warring with a rising tide of hope. Norma, we have no money. The card declined. This man, he says I'm broke. Norma wiped her eyes. She leaned into the camera. You're not broke, George. Well, technically our liquid cash is 0 for the next 24 hours until the bonds clear. But look where I am, George. Look. She turned the camera. The view panned around the room. It showed an old stone fireplace, a mantel with a carved S brand. It showed the view out the window, rolling hills, a specific creek, a fence line that George knew better than the back of his hand. That's... George's knees went weak again, but this time from awe. That's Daddy's ranch. It went to auction this morning, George, Norma said, her voice rushing. A surprise auction. The developers were going to buy it. They were going to bulldoze the house, George. They were going to turn your father's land into a strip mall. I found out 2 hours ago. I couldn't reach you. You were driving. George listened, the world narrowing down to her voice. I had to liquidate everything, George. Every account. The savings, the investments, the emergency fund. I had to put down a cash offer that they couldn't refuse. I emptied us out to save it. The message, the goodbye. I was trying to text you goodbye to the developers, but the signal cut out. And the bank alert. Oh, honey, I'm so sorry I scared you. She turned the camera back to her face. Her eyes were shining with fierce love. I bought it back, George. I bought your daddy's ranch back. It's ours. Forever. The silence in the gilded spur was different now. It wasn't the silence of humiliation. It was the silence of a vacuum before an explosion. George stared at the screen. The tears that had been born of sorrow now fell as tears of overwhelming relief and gratitude. She hadn't left him. She had saved his history. She had gambled their fortune to save the land that made him who he was. You, George whispered, a smile breaking through the cracks in his composure. You crazy woman. You spent it all. Every penny, Norma laughed, wiping a tear. We're eating beans and rice for a month, cowboy, but the land is ours. George laughed, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to shake the dust off his soul. Beans and rice sounds just fine, baby. Just fine. He looked up. The fear was gone. The confusion was gone. In its place was the steel that had stared down bulls and critics for 50 years. He looked at Julian. Julian looked confused. He had heard snippets. Ranch? Beans? What is this nonsense? Are you done with your little soap opera? Get out. George didn't hang up. He held the phone to his chest, keeping Norma close. He slowly stood to his full height. He seemed to grow 3 inches. The slump in his shoulders vanished. He wiped the water from his shirt with a slow, deliberate motion. He looked at Sarah, the crying intern who had just been fired for showing him kindness. He winked at her. Then he turned his gaze to Julian. The blue eyes were no longer watery. They were cold, hard, and piercing. I'm not leaving, George said. His voice was calm, but it carried a weight that made the glass shelves rattle. Julian stepped back, unnerved by the sudden change in atmosphere. Excuse me? I will call the police. Call them, George said. But before you do, I have another call to make. George reached into his inside jacket pocket. He pulled out a second phone. It was an old beat-up flip phone, the kind that battery lasted for a week, the kind he only used for one thing, his oil investors, the Texas tea money, the money that wasn't in the family checking account, the money that sat in a trust so deep and so vast that even Norma didn't touch it because it was for the great-grandchildren. He flipped it open. He dialed a number from memory. Bob? George said into the flip phone, never taking his eyes off Julian. Yeah, it's George. I need a favor. I'm at a little shop called the Gilded Spur in Dallas. Yeah, I need you to authorize a transfer. No, not a withdrawal, a purchase. Julian frowned. What are you doing? George listened to the voice on the other end. Yeah, the unlimited line. Activate it. Now. He snapped the flip phone shut. He looked at Julian. You said this store is for people with credit, George said, stepping forward. Julian stepped back, hitting the counter. You said I couldn't afford a scarf. You can't, Julian squeaked. Your card declined. That was my checking account, George said softly. That was my walking around money. You made a mistake, son. You judged the book by the cover, and you insulted my wife. George walked over to the scarf on the scanner. He didn't pick it up. He placed his hand on the counter. I'm not buying the scarf, George said. Then what are you buying? Julian demanded, trying to regain his composure. George looked around the store. He looked at the antlers. He looked at the floor. He looked at the building structure. I'm buying the building, George said. Julian froze. What? And the inventory, George continued, and the lease, and the company that owns this franchise. You're insane, Julian laughed nervously. You're delusional. George pointed to the card terminal. Run it again, but this time punch in 5 million. Julian stared at him. 5 million? That should cover the building and the stock, don't you think? George smiled, but it was a wolf's smile. Do it. Or are you afraid? Julian, trembling, reached for the terminal. He was calling the bluff. He keyed in the amount. 5,000 bokais. He looked at George. George pulled a small gold card from the flip phone case. It didn't have a bank logo, it just had a signature. George Straight. He tapped it on the machine. The machine thought. It spun. Julian held his breath, ready to laugh, ready to throw this old man out. Beep. The receipt printer began to chug, spitting out a long white tongue of paper. Julian's face went white. All the blood drained from his head. He gripped the counter to keep from fainting. George reached out and tore the receipt off the machine. He looked at it, then tucked it into his pocket. He turned to Sarah. What's your last name, darling? George asked gently. Miller, Sarah stammered. Sarah Miller. Well, Ms. Miller, George said, his voice loud enough for Julian to hear every syllable. It seems I am the new owner of this establishment, and I have some changes to make regarding the management. The thermal paper of the receipt continued to curl out of the machine, a long white tongue mocking the silence that had descended upon the room. It was the only sound in the universe, that rhythmic, mechanical chug, chug, chug of a transaction so large it seemed to require extra effort from the printer. $5 million. It was a number that didn't just buy inventory, it bought obedience, it bought the air in the room. Julian stood frozen, his manicured hands hovering uselessly over the counter. His face, previously flushed with the heat of his own arrogance, had drained to the color of old parchment. He stared at the receipt as if it were a death warrant. The digital display on the terminal still glowed with the green letters. Approved. George Straight didn't gloat. He didn't smile a winner's smile. He simply reached out with a hand that had roped steers and strummed guitars for 50 years, and he tore the paper from the machine. The sound was sharp, like a whip crack. He folded it neatly, once, twice with agonizing slowness, and tucked it into the pocket of his dusty work shirt, right next to his heart. You seem quiet, son, George said. His voice was low, a deep baritone rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. It wasn't the voice of a singer now. It was the voice of a patriarch. A minute ago, you had quite a lot to say about my boots, my bank account, and my wife. Julian swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed convulsively. He looked at George, really looked at him for the first time. He looked past the dust and the fraying collar. He saw the set of the jaw. He saw the eyes that had looked out from 1,000 album covers. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the stomach. You, Julian whispered, his voice cracking. You're... him. I'm just a customer, George corrected him, his tone steely. Or I was. Now, I suppose I'm the landlord. George turned his back on Julian, dismissing him as one would dismiss a fly. He looked towards Sarah Miller. The young woman was still clutching the water cup she had tried to give him, her knuckles white. She was trembling, caught between the terror of losing her job and the shock of witnessing a miracle. George walked over to her. He moved with that signature easy gait, the walk of a man who has spent a lifetime in the saddle. He stopped in front of her and took his hat off, holding it against his chest, a gesture of old-school respect that Julian had never shown anyone in his life. Sarah, George said softly. You all right? I think so, sir, she stammered. Tears were still brimming in her large, kind eyes. I'm so confused. Did you really? I really did, George nodded. He gestured around the opulent store. It's a bit flashy for my taste. Too much gold, not enough heart. But it has potential, mostly because of the people in it, or at least one of the people in it. He placed his hat back on his head, adjusting the brim just so. You were fired a few minutes ago for offering water to a thirsty man. Is that right? Sarah nodded, sniffing. Yes, sir. Mr. Julian said... He said no handouts. Well, George said, his voice hardening slightly as he glanced back at Julian, that policy changes today. In fact, a lot of policies change today. George pulled the flip phone back out. The call with the bank was ended, but the video call on his smartphone, still clutched in his other hand, was active. He lifted the smartphone. Norma was still there. She had watched the whole thing in silence, her hand covering her mouth, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and adoration. Did you see that, honey? George asked the screen. George Harvey straight, Norma's voice came through, thick with emotion. You are a crazy old man. We just spent our life savings on the ranch, and now you spent the oil trust on a boutique? Have you lost your mind? Maybe. George winked at the camera. But I couldn't let him talk to you like that, and I couldn't leave this girl here. He turned the phone so Norma could see Sarah. Norma, this is Sarah. She's the only person in Dallas who treated me like a human being when I walked in here, looking like something the cat dragged in. Norma's face softened on the screen. Hello, Sarah. Thank you for taking care of my husband. He can be a handful when he's hungry and tired. Sarah managed a weak, watery laugh. It's an honor, ma'am. George turned back to business. He looked at Julian, who was now trying to make himself invisible behind the register. Julian! George's voice barked. It wasn't a shout, but it commanded instant attention. Julian jumped. Yes, sir, Mr. Straight, sir, I'm so sorry. If I had known, truly, it was a misunderstanding. The lighting in here and the dust. I didn't recognize... Stop, George said. He held up a hand. Just stop. He walked back to the counter, his boots heavy on the wood. He leaned in close. That's the problem, Julian. You think you need to know who someone is to treat them with decency. You think respect is something people have to buy with a platinum card. You think a man in a three-piece suit is worth more than a man in work clothes. George pointed to the floor, where the puddle of water from the cup Julian had slapped away was still spreading, soaking into the expensive wood. You made a mess, George said. I'll call the cleaning crew, Julian said quickly, reaching for the landline. I'll have it spotless in... No, George said. He reached over the counter. He grabbed a roll of paper towels that was hidden underneath for spills. He tossed the roll at Julian. It hit the man in the chest. You clean it, George said. Julian stared at the paper towels. Me? But I'm the manager. I don't... You were the manager, George corrected. As of 3 minutes ago, when the transaction cleared, I became the owner. And as the owner, I'm making some staffing changes. George turned to Sarah. Sarah, how long have you worked here? 6 months, sir. I'm an intern. I'm studying business at SMU. Well, your internship is over, George said. Congratulations. You're the new general manager of the Gilded Spur. Sarah's jaw dropped. Me? But sir, I don't know how to run a store like this. You know the most important thing, George said. You know how to treat people. The rest is just math and inventory. You can hire people to do the math. I need someone here with a heart. He looked back at Julian. And you. You have 2 choices. You can walk out that door right now with no reference, no severance, and I will personally make sure every high-end retailer from here to New York knows exactly why you were let go. Julian paled. In his world, reputation was everything. A black mark from George Strait would end his career. Or, Julian whispered. Or, George continued, you can stay, but not as manager. You start at the bottom. You learn what it feels like to serve. You learn humility. And your first job is to get on your knees and clean up that water you spilled. The silence stretched again. It was a test, a crucible. Julian looked at the door. He looked at the paper towels in his hand. He looked at the expensive suit he was wearing. Then, slowly, painfully, Julian lowered himself. His knees hit the hard wood. He tore off a sheet of paper towel. He began to wipe the floor. George watched him for a moment, not with satisfaction, but with a somber expression. It wasn't about revenge. It was about correction. It was a lesson a father teaches a wayward son. "Good," George said quietly. "Do a good job. Sarah will inspect it when you're done." At that moment, the glass doors of the store slid open. A couple walked in, a woman in diamonds and a man in a cowboy hat that cost more than a horse. They were the typical clientele. They stopped, confused by the scene, a young girl crying, a man in a dusty suit scrubbing the floor, and an old cowboy standing in the center of it all. The woman squinted. She took a step forward, her eyes widening. "Oh my heavens," she gasped, clutching her husband's arm. Bill, look, is that—" Her husband looked. His jaw went slack. "Well, I'll be damned. It's the king." They didn't see a dusty old man. They saw George Strait. The aura of the legend filled the room, pushing back the sterility of the shop. George tipped his hat to them. "Afternoon, folks. We're undergoing a little restructuring, but Sarah here will be happy to help you in a few minutes." He turned back to the phone in his hand. He needed to get out of there. The air was too recycled. He needed the heat. He needed the road. And more than anything, he needed to get to that ranch. "Norma," he said into the phone, "I'm coming home." "To the house?" she asked. "No," George said, his voice cracking slightly with emotion. "To the ranch, to Daddy's place. I'm driving straight there. I want to walk the fence line before the sun goes down." Norma smiled through her tears on the screen. "I'll be waiting on the porch, George. I'll have the beans on the stove." "I love you, Norma," George said. The words were heavy with the terror of the last hour. When I saw that message, I thought my life was over." "I'm not going anywhere, cowboy," she whispered. "We have a second act to live, a legacy to build." "Yeah," George said. "Project Legacy." He looked at Sarah one last time. She was standing taller now, wiping her eyes, preparing to greet the new customers. She looked terrified, but she also looked determined. "Sarah," George called out. She turned. "Yes, Mr. Strait." "This store, it sells a lot of things people don't need," he said, gesturing to the gold-plated antlers and the overpriced boots. "But that scarf." He pointed to the lavender silk scarf that was still sitting on the counter where Julian had tossed it. "Wrap that up for me." Sarah hurried to the counter. She folded the scarf with reverence, placing it in a beautiful box with a silver ribbon. She brought it to him. "Here you go, sir." "Put it on my account," George joked dryly, "since I own the place." He took the box. It was the gift for Norma. It had almost cost him his dignity, but instead it had cost him $5 million and gained him a renewed perspective on what really mattered. He walked toward the door. As he passed Julian, who was still on his knees scrubbing a spot that was already dry, George paused. "Julian," George said. Julian looked up, sweat beading on his forehead, his eyes red. "Yes, sir?" "When you're done with the floor," George said, "go to the back and find a mirror. Take a good long look and ask yourself if you like the man staring back at you. If the answer is no, fix it. It's never too late to be a better man. I've had to reinvent myself a dozen times. You can do it once." He didn't wait for an answer. The automatic doors whooshed open and the Texas heat rushed in to meet him like an old friend. George stepped out onto the sidewalk. The sun was lower now, casting long golden shadows across the parking lot. His truck sat there covered in dust, surrounded by the gleaming luxury cars. It looked beautiful. It looked real. He climbed into the cab of the Silverado. The seat was hot, burning his back, but he didn't care. He placed the box with the scarf on the passenger seat as if it were a passenger. He placed his phone in the holder. He started the engine. The V8 roared to life, a guttural mechanical sound that drowned out the polite hum of the city traffic. He pulled out of the parking lot, leaving the gilded spur behind. He was leaving behind the world of pretension, the world where value was determined by a price tag. He was heading toward the dusty road, toward the land, toward the woman who had gambled everything on a piece of dirt because she knew that dirt held their souls. As he hit the highway, merging into the traffic heading west, the radio crackled. By some cosmic coincidence, or perhaps the DJ knew something was in the air, The opening chords of Troubadour began to play. George smiled, a genuine, crinkly-eyed smile. He turned the volume up. "I was a young troubadour when I rode in on a song, and I'll be an old troubadour when I'm gone." He sang along, his voice filling the cab. But the story wasn't over. The purchase of the store was just the skirmish. The real battle and the real revelation awaited at the ranch. Because Norma hadn't just bought the land back. She had found something that had been hidden for 50 years, something that the developers had been desperate to get their hands on, and the reason why the goodbye message had been so frantic. The phone buzzed again. A text from Norma. "Norma, drive fast, George. There's someone here waiting for you. Someone we haven't seen in a long time, and you need to see what we found in your daddy's old safe." George's heart skipped a beat. The adrenaline that had just subsided spiked again. The ranch wasn't just a nostalgic purchase, it was a mystery. He pressed down on the accelerator. The white truck surged forward, eating up the asphalt, chasing the setting sun. The city faded in the rearview mirror, replaced by the open plains, the mesquite, and the endless Texas sky. He was going home, but he had no idea that home had changed. The transition from the paved highway to the county road was marked not by a sign but by a sound. It was the rhythmic, crunching hum of tires rolling over caliche and gravel, a sound that George Strait had known before he knew how to walk. The white Chevrolet Silverado, still carrying the heat of the city on its hood, slowed down as the smooth asphalt gave way to the scarred, uneven earth of the Texas hill country. The dust began to rise behind the truck, a billowing orange cloud that hung in the stagnant evening air, like a veil separating the past from the present. George gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. The adrenaline from the confrontation at the Gilded Spur had begun to fade, replaced by a deep, resonant ache in his chest. It was a mixture of anxiety and a profound, almost spiritual longing. He hadn't set foot on this specific plot of land in 25 years. It was the place where he had learned to ride, where he had learned to rope, and where he had watched his father, a man of few words and immense strength, wither away under the weight of debts he couldn't pay. Losing the Big S Ranch had been the single greatest failure of George's life, a shadow that no amount of platinum records or sold-out stadium tours could ever truly banish. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and burnt orange. The mesquite trees cast long, skeletal shadows across the fields that were overgrown with wild rye and thistle. As the truck crested the final hill, the homestead came into view. It was a sight that made George pull the truck over and kill the engine. The house was still standing. It was a two-story limestone structure built by his grandfather's hands in the 1920s, but it was tired. The tin roof was rusted to a deep, blood-red hue. The windows were dark, like hollow eyes, staring out at a world that had moved on. The white fence that used to encircle the yard was broken, looking like a smile with missing teeth. It was a ghost of the home he remembered, but it was still beautiful. It stood with a defiant dignity against the encroaching night. And there on the porch was a flicker of light, a lantern. George took a deep breath, the scent of sage and dry earth filling his lungs, grounding him. He started the truck again and drove slowly down the long driveway, the gravel popping under his tires. As he pulled up to the house, he saw her, Norma. She was sitting on the steps of the porch wearing jeans and a simple white t-shirt, her hair pulled back in a ponytail. She looked exhausted, her face streaked with dust, but her eyes were bright. Next to her sat an old cooler and a camping stove that was hissing softly. George stepped out of the truck. The silence of the country was heavy, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant lowing of a cow. He walked toward her, his boots crunching in the dirt. He didn't say a word. He just walked up the steps and wrapped his arms around her. They held each other for a long time. It was an embrace that communicated everything: the terror of the bank notification, the shock of the empty accounts, the audacity of the purchase, and the overwhelming relief of simply being together on their own dirt. "You're crazy," George whispered into her hair. "You know that? You're absolutely crazy." Norma pulled back, her hands resting on his chest. "I had to do it, George. The developers, they were going to tear it down tomorrow. They had the bulldozers parked 2 miles down the road. I saw the work orders. They weren't just going to build houses. They were going to erase the history. I couldn't let them erase him. She gestured to the house, invoking the spirit of George's father. So we're broke, George said, a small smile playing on his lips. Cash poor and land rich, just like Daddy was. We have beans, Norma said, pointing to the camping stove. And we have a roof. It leaks a little in the kitchen, but it's ours. George looked at the house. I can fix a leak. I've fixed worse. Come inside, Norma said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. There's someone you need to see. He's been waiting for you in the study. George frowned. Who? Just come. They walked into the house. The air inside was stale, smelling of old paper and trapped heat, but underneath it was the familiar scent of cedar wood and lemon oil, the smell of his childhood. The furniture was gone, sold off in the auction years ago, leaving the rooms feeling cavernous and large. Their footsteps echoed on the hardwood floors. Norma led him to the back of the house, to the study. This was the room where his father had spent his nights going over ledgers, trying to make the math of ranching work in a world that didn't care about cowboys. Sitting in the corner on a folding chair that Norma must have brought was a man. He was ancient. His skin was like crumpled leather, his back bent like a bow. He held a cane in both hands, resting his chin on it. He wore a hat that was so old it had lost its shape entirely. George squinted in the dim light of the lantern Norma had placed on the floor. Then the man looked up, and George saw the eyes, sharp, intelligent, and familiar. Hello, George, the man rasped. His voice sounded like gravel grinding together. George stopped dead in his tracks. Silas. It was Silas, the foreman, the man who had taught George how to throw a lasso, the man who had practically raised him when his father was working the fields. Silas had disappeared the day the ranch was sold. George had assumed he had passed away years ago. I thought you were dead, George said, walking forward and kneeling beside the chair. He took the old man's hand. It felt like holding a bundle of dry twigs. Not yet, Silas chuckled, a dry wheezing sound. I've been around staying in the old trapper's cabin up on the North Ridge, keeping watch. Keeping watch? George asked. Over what? Over the legacy, Silas said. He tapped his cane on the floor. Your daddy. He knew this day would come. He knew you'd come back. He made me promise to stay until you did. Silas pointed a shaky finger toward the wall behind the empty desk. The safe, the new owners, the bank. They never cracked it. They thought it was empty. They didn't know the combination. Your daddy was a clever man. George looked at the wall safe. It was an old iron box built into the limestone. He remembered it well. He remembered his father telling him, George, there are some things you don't put in a bank. You put them in the bedrock. Norma knows the numbers, Silas said. George looked at Norma. She nodded. Your dad's birthday and the day you released Unwound. George felt a lump in his throat. His father had cared about his music. He had always seemed so indifferent, so focused on the ranch work. George walked to the safe. He spun the dial. Left to 19, right to 52, left to 81. The mechanism groaned, the tumblers falling into place with a heavy clunk that echoed through the silent house. George pulled the heavy iron handle. The door creaked open, shedding flakes of rust. The safe wasn't empty. Inside there was no money, no gold bars, no stacks of cash. There was a single thick envelope made of yellowed manila paper and a small rectangular box. George took them out. His hands were trembling. He carried them over to the lantern light. Norma and Silas watched him in silence. He opened the envelope first. Inside was a legal document, covered in stamps and official seals from the state of Texas, dated 1998, the year the ranch was lost. And clipped to it was a handwritten letter. George unfolded the letter. The handwriting was his father's, spiky, efficient, no nonsense. Son, if you're reading this, it means you found your way back home. I knew you would. You have the straight blood and this dirt is in it. You probably spent years thinking I lost this place because I was a bad businessman. Maybe I was, but I didn't lose it because of the debt. I let the bank take the surface rights because I had to make a choice. I could have sold the mineral rights to the oil company that came knocking in '97. They offered me enough to clear the debt and keep the house. But the contract said they would strip mine the north pasture. They would have poisoned the creek where you learned to fish. They would have turned our home into a wasteland. I chose the land over the ownership. I let them foreclose on the house to save the soul of the ranch. I hid the mineral rights deed in this safe. The bank doesn't know. The developers don't know. They bought the surface, but they don't own what's underneath. I'm leaving this to you, not so you can drill it, but so you can protect it. As long as you hold this deed, no one can tear up this land. You are the guardian now. I never said it enough, but I am proud of you, George. Not because you sing pretty, but because you are a good man. Love, Daddy. Tears streamed down George's face, hot and fast. He hadn't cried like this since the funeral. For decades, he had carried the guilt of his father's failure, thinking he hadn't done enough to help. But it hadn't been a failure. It had been a sacrifice. His father had chosen poverty to preserve the land for the future. He saved it, George whispered, his voice breaking. He didn't lose it. He saved it. Norma wiped her own eyes. Read the document, George. George looked at the deed. It was a perpetual retention of mineral and subsurface rights, irrevocable and transferable only by bloodline. It gave the holder veto power over any development that disturbed the bedrock. This is it, George said, realizing the magnitude of the paper in his hand. This is why the developers were frantic. They must have found out about the deed's existence but couldn't find it. They wanted to bulldoze the house to find the safe. Open the box, Silas rasped. George picked up the small rectangular box. It was velvet, worn smooth by time. He opened it. Inside lay a pocket watch. It was silver, engraved with a scene of a bucking bronco, but it wasn't just a watch. Tucked underneath it was a folded piece of paper with lyrics scrawled on it. The road is long and the dust is high, but a cowboy's truth is in the sky. Don't trade your soul for a city light, just keep it steady and hold on tight. It was a song his father had written, a song George had never heard. Suddenly the sound of engines cut through the emotional silence. Bright, high-intensity LED headlights swept across the windows of the study, blinding them for a moment. The crunch of heavy tires on gravel was aggressive, fast. "Company," Silas said, his grip tightening on his cane. George stood up. He carefully placed the letter and the deed back in the envelope and handed it to Norma. "Put this in your purse," he said, "and don't let it go." He put the hat back on his head. The sorrow in his eyes evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. He walked to the front door, his boots thudding with purpose. He stepped out onto the porch. 3 black SUVs were parked in the driveway, their engines idling. Men in suits were stepping out. They didn't look like bankers. They looked like sharks in expensive tailoring. The lead man, a tall figure with slicked back hair and a smile that didn't reach his eyes, stepped forward. He held a briefcase. "Mr. Straight," the man called out, feigning friendliness. "We saw the lights. We heard about the sudden acquisition. Quite a dramatic move, buying the property hours before demolition." George stood on the top step, looking down at them. He leaned against the porch column, crossing his arms. "It's private property," George said calmly, "which means you're trespassing." Now, Mr. Straight," the man said, walking closer. "Let's be reasonable. My name is Mr. Vance. I represent the consortium that previously had an interest in this land. We are willing to make you a very generous offer. We know you paid a premium today. We are prepared to double it right now, tonight." "Double?" George asked, his face unreadable. "Triple," Vance said quickly. "Look, let's be honest, this is a ruin, it's a money pit. You're a celebrity, Mr. Straight. You belong in a penthouse, not a fixer-upper. We have a check for $10 million prepared. Just sign the title over." George looked at the check Vance was waving. $10 million. It would refill his bank accounts. It would pay for the boutique he had just bought on a whim. It would secure an easy life. But then he thought of the letter in the safe. He thought of his father sitting in that dark study, refusing the oil money to save the creek. He thought of Norma selling everything she owned to buy back his history. He thought of Julian at the store, thinking money was the only measure of a man. George laughed. It was a low, dry chuckle. "You don't want the house, Mr. Vance," George said. "You want what's under it." Vance's smile faltered. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do," George said. "You know about the mineral rights. You know about the water table. You know that this land is the key to the whole valley. And you know that without my signature, You can't dig an inch." Vance dropped the pretense. His face hardened. "You're an old man, Straight. You're washed up. You have no liquidity. We checked your accounts. You're broke. You can't afford the taxes on this land, let alone the restoration. Take the money, or we will bury you in litigation for the next 20 years. George slowly walked down the steps. He stopped 3 feet from Vance. The difference in presence was palpable. Vance was a corporate suit. George was a mountain. "How you checked my accounts?" George said softly. "But you didn't check my friends." George pointed to the dark horizon. "You see, Mr. Vance, out here we don't rely on banks. We rely on neighbors." As if on cue, headlights appeared on the hill. Not one pair, dozens. Trucks were cresting the ridge. Beat-up Fords, muddy Chevys, tractors. They were coming down the county road, a convoy of yellow lights cutting through the darkness. "I made a few calls on the way here," George said. "I called the people who remember my daddy, the people whose fences he fixed, the people whose cattle he helped pull from the mud." The trucks pulled into the long driveway, flanking the black SUVs. Men and women stepped out, ranchers, farmers, mechanics. They weren't armed with guns. They were armed with something stronger: solidarity. They stood by their trucks, silent, watching. "This isn't just land," George said, his voice rising, resonating with the power that had captivated millions. "This is Texas, and in Texas, you don't bully a man on his own front porch." Vance looked around nervously. He was outnumbered. He was out of his element. The threat of litigation seemed weak against the wall of trucks and the grim-faced locals. "This isn't over," Vance spat, backing toward his SUV. "It is over," George said, "because I have the deed, and I have the time. I'm retired, Mr. Vance. I have nothing but time. I'll sit on this porch and watch the grass grow for the next 20 years if I have to. But you will never, ever touch this earth." Vance glared at him one last time, then signaled his men. They scrambled back into the SUVs. The vehicles reversed aggressively, kicking up gravel, and sped away into the night, defeated by a piece of paper and a cowboy's resolve. The locals cheered. Horns honked. It was a victory not just for George, but for the whole community. George waved to them, thanking them. He shook hands. He hugged old friends he hadn't seen in decades. Hours later, the trucks had gone. The silence returned, but it was a peaceful silence now. George sat on the porch swing next to Norma. The lantern was dimming. The stars were out, a canopy of diamonds stretching across the vast, dark sky, brighter than they ever were in the city. He held the pocket watch in his hand, running his thumb over the engraving. "You know," George said softly, staring at the moon, "I walked into that store today thinking I was going to buy you a scarf. I thought that was the gift." Norma rested her head on his shoulder. "It's a beautiful scarf, George. I saw the box in the truck." "But you gave me the real gift," George said. "You gave me the truth. You gave me my father back." He picked up his acoustic guitar, which he had retrieved from the back seat of the truck. It was battered, scratched, and travel-worn, just like him. He strummed a G chord. It rang out clear and true in the night air. "I think I'm going to record one last song," George said. "Daddy's song." "Project Legacy?" Norma asked, smiling. "Project Legacy," George nodded. He began to pick the melody, finding the tune that had been hidden in the safe for 25 years. He began to sing, his voice raspy with fatigue but rich with emotion. "The road is long and the dust is high, but a cowboy's truth is in the sky." The camera pulls back slowly, rising above the porch, above the rusted roof of the reclaimed house. We see the two figures sitting close together, surrounded by the vast, dark expanse of the Texas land that is safe once more. The sound of the guitar fades into the wind, carrying the song across the hills, a lullaby for the land and a testament to the fact that some things, like love, honor, and the dirt under your boots, can never be bought, only earned. The screen fades to black, leaving only the sound of the wind and the faint enduring echo of a country song.